31-year-old John O'Brien was a landscaper in a town just outside of Chicago, Illinois. In January of that year, he and his friend David, they decided to book a trip to the very sunny Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. By all accounts, their vacation was going exactly to plan until Sunday, the 14th of January. That day, John began complaining of some unnamed health issue, which has not been made public, so we don't know what it is, and he went to some drugstore in town in Trinidad to look for a specific medication for this unnamed health issue. But the drugstore did not carry this medication, so John left and he went to another drugstore and another store, but nobody had this medication. David would later remark that John was not only distraught about not having this medication, but John was disoriented, and the two men decided to just go to bed, because after all, they had a very early flight the next morning. But about an hour to maybe an hour and a half after David had fallen asleep, he wakes up to some man standing next to his bed, choking him. He's grabbing his throat and throttling him, and so David has no time to respond to what's going on. He just starts grabbing this guy's hands, and he manages to push them off of him, and then this guy who's standing next to his bed grabs the lamp next to him and smashes David with it. David, from getting hit, falls out of the bed, he lands on the ground, and this guy, his attacker, jumps on top of him, and the two men are fighting, but eventually David manages to overpower this guy, and he kicks him off. And as soon as he does that, he realizes this guy that's been attacking him is John, and John is completely naked. He's got no clothes on. And so John just stands up, and David's looking at him like, what's going on? And John just runs out of the hotel room. He ends up running down the hall. He goes down the stairs. He runs past the front desk, out the front doors of the hotel, and just takes off running. And so John runs for several minutes until he reaches the airport, but instead of going through the front gates, he goes to the side of the front gates where there are these huge chain link fences with barbed wire at the top. And John, again wearing no clothes, climbs up the chain link fence and then manages to navigate the barbs at the top and drops over onto the other side. But where he landed, although it was on airport property, it was kind of like a trap, because this airport had two fences around its perimeter back to back. And so where John landed was like this grassy no man's land between these two fences. But John was on this kind of deranged mission, so he stands up, and instead of trying to get back out again, he turns and climbs the next fence, the one that is closer to the airport. He stands up and just continues running towards the main building of the airport. But between him and the main building of this airport is this huge concrete wall that doesn't look like it has any place to grab onto to climb over it. But John runs up to this wall and manages to climb up and over the wall. And where he landed on the other side was right next to this security guard shack. And so he comes crashing down, and the four security guards that are in this shack, they see him come over the wall. They see this naked guy just suddenly appear, and so they charge out to apprehend him and figure out what's going on. But John apparently attacked them. We don't know exactly what he did, but he managed to overpower all four of them, and he stole their four-wheel drive vehicle. And so John just bombs away from the security guard shack with the four security guards chasing him on foot, and John, he weaves around the outside of the main airport building, and he heads out onto the tarmac. Out on the tarmac, there were several planes that were moving into position for takeoff. One of those planes was this huge British Airways jet airliner passenger plane that was actually the next to take off. They'd already fired up their engines, and they were sitting at the top of the runway just waiting for clearance. And John just drives directly into this plane. But the vehicle he was driving, this little four-wheel drive vehicle, it was not tall enough to actually strike the main body of this plane. So instead, when he hit this plane, he basically got wedged underneath one of the wings. At this point, the four security guards that had been attacked and had their vehicle stolen from them, I mean, they're running towards the tarmac, but they've also alerted other security personnel in the airport who are all streaming out onto the tarmac towards this British Airways plane and this vehicle and John. And so as they are descending on the scene, the security guards would see John from the passenger seat of this four-wheel drive vehicle. He stands up, and they can see he's got a pretty nasty cut on his shoulder. And John reaches up and starts rubbing his hand on the underside of the plane, which had been damaged from running into it. And there was oil leaking off the underside of this plane, and John began rubbing this oil around and then dabbing it into his big wound on his shoulder. And then after packing it with this oil, John leapt out of the wrecked wrecked four-wheel drive vehicle and then just took off running away from all these security guards and away from this plane. And in the chaos of this moment, all these security guards and all the airport personnel that were descending on this scene, they managed to lose sight of John. He disappeared on the backside of this plane when all of a sudden somebody notices John about 300 feet away on the other side of the plane. He comes out from behind a building. And so he's running towards the plane. He's running towards this wall of security guards and other airport staff. And John, he manages to get all the way up to the plane before anybody can come up and apprehend him. And when he reaches the plane, he stops for a second, looks up at the engine of this airplane that's still spinning. It's been turned on, and John jumps into the engine, and instantaneously, John ceases to exist. He is completely decimated. No one knows for sure what actually caused John's rampage, although it's assumed it had to do with whatever this unnamed health issue was. Ultimately, his death was ruled a suicide. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.